Um, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Kadima, and I'll be speaking about Afrophobia and whether we will ever see an end to this type of phobia. Um, the first thing I'll start by discussing is the definition of Afrophobia and what it entails. So, in simple terms, Afrophobia is the fear of African migrants or African people, if I can put it in that word. And in such a situation, Afrophobia can either happen amongst African people in African countries, or it can even happen between African people who are living in diaspora, such as in Europe, in Asia, in America, and so on and so forth. So what I'll be discussing today um, concerns Afrophobia and the solutions as Africans that we can find to solve this type of phobia. So, over the years, one has come to understand that Afrophobia did not only did not only manifest during the post-colonial era of Africa, but has been as a result of colonial Africa, and as such, during when African countries were in their colonial era, when they were being colonized by different countries, different European countries, and so on and so forth. African people were not exposed to themselves. So then came the post-colonial era where African countries got independence, and therefore, you know, it ended up being it ended up African people end up moving amongst each other. So one of the one of the key topics I think I'll be discussing here is what fuels Afrophobia, what fuels Afrophobia, what are the solutions we should as Africans be looking at to solve this type of, of phobia. So I've defined already Afrophobia, that is the fear, in simple terms, the fear of Africans amongst themselves, So one of the questions I was given here, one of the guiding questions by the African Matters team was that they were asking me was, would one say that Afrophobia is incorrectly diagnosed as xenophobia? And what is the historical context of this theory? So I think we tend to use the word Afrophobia and xenophobia interchangeably. And for me particularly, I think that those words should not be used interchangeably, because they are defined separately. As much as they can be defined, they are defined as the fear of migrants. But Afrophobia specifically is the fear of African migrants, or African people. What xenophobia? I tend to use it as a family name, which is the fear of immigrants generally. So I think when we are discussing about Afrophobia, and particularly in the context of Africa, it is very much important that we term it Afrophobia, the fear of African migrants or African people in Africa. So I tend to use the word Afrophobia because I feel that that's the best definition that we can use to define the situation that we find ourselves in around the continent. Now, the African Union has released, as its Agenda 2063, which is its policy framework that discusses a lot of things about the integration of Africa and so on and so forth. And one of the things that it tries to highlight is that for Africa to be prosperous, it needs to be integrated. Now, the integration of Africa has not yet been achieved since countries and their independence in different years, such as in the 1960s and so on and so forth. And there is a need that the integration of Africa needs to be achieved very quickly for Africa to develop itself, economically, and experience economic growth. And I'm one of the people who, as the firm believe that for Africa to achieve economic growth or economic development as a continent together, it will require the integration of Africans together, the unity of Africans. And Afrophobia is one of the things that hampers this development, economic growth and economic development in the continent. So I'm totally for the use of the word Afrophobia than rather xenophobia, because in Africa we tend to have fear of other African migrants that come into our countries, and therefore we tend to hate them for who they are, because the common denominator in such situations are always Black Africans rather than other immigrants that come from other countries. Therefore, I think the suitability, there is a need for us to use the word Afrophobia and not xenophobia. And I've already mentioned, I think earlier on, the historical context of why we need to mention Afrophobia. As a continent, we were closed to ourselves during the colonial era, and once our countries got independence, people started moving up and down, and therefore obviously there's that kind of what I will term in quotation marks a shock, you understand, for a shock amongst, who is this person and where are they from and so on and so forth, and that obviously tends to cause such hatred amongst African migrants and so on and so forth. So, but again, one other issue is we cannot only blame it on the past that Africa has faced. It can also be blamed on the issues that our leaders have failed to integrate Africa, and the usage of words such as illegal immigrants used by different African citizens, who use the word illegal immigrants and so on and so forth. I remember there's an author who spoke from Colgate University abroad, who wrote an article in the Daily Maverick, O'Malley and Guardian, I think, who spoke about the usage of the word illegal immigrant and how it can reinforce Afrophobia and so on and so forth. So the other question I'll be dealing with is, should Afrophobia be attributed to migration laws? What are some examples of how this can be, how migration laws can contribute to Afrophobia? So to a certain extent, I believe that Afrophobia can be fueled by migration laws that different countries pass, because in such a way, in such a situation, for example, we do know that African countries have tight migration laws against themselves compared to people from outside. So, for example, we know even one of Africa's richest person, Alik Dangote, had complained about being denied a visa to enter into Angola, although he was using an African Union passport and so on and so forth. So such things can contribute to Afrophobia. And we do know that it is easy for a British citizen to move from Cairo to Cape Town without being stopped at any border post or being required to show proof of a visa because of the migration laws that have been placed in those countries that he will be passing through. But if an African is to move from Cairo to Cape Town, then there's going to be an issue, because he will be stopped in about 30 countries before he reaches Cape Town, and he's going to be asked, or she's going to be asked, to produce their visas or travel documents to prove that they are really documented. So I think to a certain extent that contributes, that aspect contributes to Afrophobia. The other question I'll be dealing with here is that I'm going to try to answer now is, what can members of the diaspora play towards eradicating Afrophobia? So each and everyone as African citizens, as from our respective countries, we can play our role in curbing Afrophobia, in that we can be the voice of migrants. We can be the voice of migrants in writing in different newspapers and as opinion articles about how Africa can be united and so on and so forth, and in our respective workplaces. So I do really think that members of the diaspora can play a role in eradicating Afrophobia, in that they are well behaved in the countries they go to, or they are living in, and also integrate with the people of that particular country that they're living in. So that will create a sense of unity and integration between the diaspora and the citizens of that particular country they are living in, so that those myths are broken, the myths that are there about certain migrants are broken, and so on and so forth. Can the lack of education on African history or African unity continue to be a justifiable cause of Afrophobia? Yes, indeed. And the lack of education on African history and African unity can be one of the causes that can be one of the causes of Afrophobia, because when African citizens around their respective African countries do not learn of the history of Africa, where Africa came from to where Africa is going, it can be a problem, because then it can fuel Afrophobia, in that people do not know their history, they do not know the policy that the African Union has passed about the integration of Africa, and therefore it can fuel Afrophobia in many ways. Is that one of the solutions is for schools, high schools, primary schools, to include history as probably a compulsory subject, where African children can learn about the history of the continent and about African unity. In that way, they'll be able to understand that as a continent we are one, we're a region, we're one region, and we should all be united together for the integration and prosperity of Africa. So, for example, I've seen news articles whereby they have spoken, we have seen about how schools are integrating Swahili into primary schools and so on and so forth. So that is one of the very good aspects, because then as an African language, Swahili is being, taught in primary school. So I think that's one of the things I think like African countries should be able to take into consideration of implementing Kiswahili as a language in the various schools. That will contribute to unity. And also the issue of African unity. The issue of African unity is one that can be also spoken about in various forms. So, for example, universities need to take ownership into creating panel discussions about African unity, invite various scholars, practitioners, for example, maybe even African Union officials, to speak about what African unity means and what are the implications thereof if there is no African unity. For example, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was passed, a few months back or a year back, and this policy tends to say or try to achieve that the African continent should be integrated together economically, or in the trade aspect. But I've always argued, and I'm a proponent, that Africa cannot be united in terms of trade and economy if its people are not united. That cannot happen. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I believe, is based on the issue of African unity and the unity of African people together. Because how do you expect to trade? How does one expect to trade together if they do not know each other or do not unite? So, for example, I will try to use the European Union as an example in terms of its unity and solidarity. So the European Union itself as a regional body has integrated itself, has integrated its members together, despite their diverse views, you understand, to have integrated each other to work for the success of the European Union and its member states. For example, they have a European Central Bank that helps countries that are in financial distress and so on and so forth. But all that comes through what? All that comes through the unity of member states. For example, member states being integrated amongst each other. So it is very vital that the African Union tells its member states to be able to preach about African unity in a way that will be able to be the foundation for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to be successful. Without that, then there's no African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and therefore I think that policy will fail, or that framework will fail. The other question I'll deal with is Afrophobia undermines African unity. That being said, what more can the African Union do to see an end to Afrophobia? And how best can youth be involved in this process? So indeed, one of the things I've always said is the future belongs to the youth, and therefore we as the youth need to be able to run, the agenda of a prosperous and united Africa. Without us, we will not experience in our lifetime African unity. We will not experience whether Afrophobia will ever end. And therefore, we need to be able to unite each other. We need to be able to use social media. We need to be able to use our different platforms that we are, universities, schools, to be able to preach about African unity. Without that, we will never be able to achieve, an Africa without Afrophobia. And the African Union, I think, has the role and has the task morally to preach about unity in the continent, but it can only do so much. And I think they have started with the issue of releasing the African passport, which I think has had a slow start. But we have seen many African countries removing these visa restrictions that we have spoken about earlier on, whereby they tell us that if you're an African citizen, you can move from country A to country B and pay only for a visa at the port of entry. Such things contribute towards the unity of the African continent, and that's something we need to give the African Union kudos for, because they have taken a bold step in ensuring that countries continue. Although we have, I think, about less than 15 countries which have given African citizens visa on arrival. We need to continue building on that. It will obviously not change in a year or two, but as we go on, I think countries will come on board, because obviously there are national legislations that need to be considered and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things that the African Union has done. But what can be done more, I think, will be initiatives taken by the African Union and its other agencies to try to make sure that the issue of Afrophobia, the issue of the hatred of African people, is done I mean, they do it via events, via, there are various initiatives, so that people are aware that a united Africa is possible, and that we should not hate ourselves. So these are some of the things that I think will try to curb Afrophobia. But there's one thing I'll also try to mention is what I'm passionate about is the role of the judiciary in curbing Afrophobia. And I'll just speak generally because as Africans, I think when Afrophobia happens in different countries, we try to say what is the executive, what is the legislature done to curb Afrophobia, but we never ask ourselves about the third arm of the state, which is the judiciary. What's the role of the judiciary in curbing Afrophobia? So the judiciary, I believe, and I'm a firm believer that the judiciary has a role in terms of curbing Afrophobia, because it can give a moral guidance to the other arms of the state to say that, Afrophobia or hatred against African migrants in any way, okay, or in any type of manifestation is wrong and needs to be curbed. And I've seen many judgments court judgments that have been progressive in such a way. So that's one of the things that the judiciary can take into consideration. So I think that's all I have for now. If anyone has any questions, they can type it, then I will try to answer it. So yeah, any questions concerning Afrophobia and and how we can curb it, or any suggestions, comments of Afrophobia or the African Union, if you think it has been decisive in ending this type of phobia. So just to close off, if there are no any questions, so the following things I think we need to take into account is that the future of Africa, lies within its youth, and the youth need to be able to take it up in their own hands. So it is our task to continue fighting Afrophobia in various forms. I see a question. How about stateless people? I don't get the question. How about stateless people? If you can please give me more, give me the question precisely. So I'll come back to that question once it has been highlighted specifically. So we as Africans need to continue taking, like I said, our continent into our own hands and push for it to be united, because then we should forget that there is no African Continental Free Trade Agreement that's going to pass without the unity of its own people. That cannot happen. And I've been told by different scholars that no, that can happen, that if Africa trades amongst each other, then its people will be united. But I think it's going to be a very big task to do it. It's very impossible. It must start through the unity of its people, then we can trade amongst each other. So yeah. Then another issue is that I think we need to be able to host events. I know people on this platform, different people on this platform that are listening are probably part of organizations, are probably in agencies of the African Union. Continue creating these events in different tertiary institutions, and therefore we can curb this phobia. I see a question, could you please elaborate more on how the judiciary can play its part in curbing Afrophobia? So the judiciary is there to enforce the law. It's there to make sure that the law is followed. And as part of the state, it is in charge in determining court cases. It is in charge of passing decisions that come before it. So, for example, we have had, there was a court case I once researched on for my final year dissertation on the LLB, and there was a court case whereby refugee women were being discriminated against from participating as security guards. So the case was heard till the Court, and that's where the minority court judgment by Justice Albie Sachs stated that he warned that the court should always take account of xenophobia playing a role in policies and in laws, and therefore the Constitutional Court had told CIRA, the public service, the public security industry, that its policies against refugee women not being able to work as security guards because they were untrustworthy was wrong and was unconstitutional, and therefore that policy, that regulation of that public security industry was struck off because it was inconsistent with the Constitution. So such things, such court cases, the judiciary is playing its part in curbing Afrophobia. Although I criticized, one of my issues was criticizing the court's usage of the word xenophobia, in that it should have looked at who were the common denominators affected by this regulation, which was African refugee women, and therefore it was supposed to be Afrophobia instead of xenophobia. And but nonetheless, the court still ended up with its judgment, which, it ended up striking off that policy. So by that public security industry regulator. So such things, the judiciary plays its part, and therefore the other arms of the state need to play its part. So any questions, any more questions? I'll be waiting for them about 2 to 3 minutes. Then yeah, I think if there are no, then we'll end it here. And one more thing I just want to add is that if there's the integration of African people, I believe if there's an integration of African people, youths are able to move from one country to another within Africa, then we are able to meet different youths and mix our skills together, and therefore probably create companies, create ideas that will be very vital to the continent. Without that, I mean, we will not be able to be united as a continent. So that's one of the things. And I hear, I mean, Afrophobia is not, it tends to come with the issue of, immigrants and the laws in different countries and so on and so forth. We are not saying that Africa should be borderless, in that people pass without, documents from country A to country B. That's not what some of us proponents of a united Africa are about. We are about saying that, look, you are saying that a British man can move from country A to country B in Africa without being asked for a visa. Why can't a African citizen move from country A to country B just like a British man without being asked for a visa? And those are those immigration policies that tend to fuel Afrophobia, because then people from country A will say, those Africans from country B should not come here, they're a problem, But for a British man to pass from country A to country B without being asked a visa in Africa, it's fine. So what we are trying to say, proponents of African unity, we are trying to say, look, let there be security in all African ports. Obviously, security is a very big issue for any other African country, due to how we live, due to the world we live in now with terrorism and so on and so forth. But what we are saying is, let it be easy for an African person to move from country A to country B, and by doing that, businesses, investors, African investors can come and explore opportunities in which different Africans can be united and can be part of that project and build, big African corporations, industries run by Africans, and so on and so forth. So that's my view. So we are not saying that people should just pass and jump and everything and so on and so forth. No, but what we are saying is that let Africans be at ease to move within their country. I mean, their member states, because this does not happen in Europe. You'll never see an African moving in Europe freely. You'll be asked, where are you going and what are you going to do, or what are you coming to do here? But Europeans have finding it more easy both at home and also here, to circulate the African continent. So such issues, we need to deal with, because they tend to fuel Afrophobia amongst Africa, because Africa has a bright future ahead of it, but we cannot experience that bright future if the youths of the continent do not take it upon themselves to make sure that their voices are heard in terms of African unity and so on and so forth. So, and again, just to recap, the African Union they've done what they can do so far, and I think they can still do more in terms of making sure that the continent is united and Afrophobia is defeated. So just one more question. Do you think we will ever see an end to Afrophobia, and if you were to put a timestamp to it, when? It's very difficult to put a timestamp on ending Afrophobia due to many issues that still surround or challenge the continent. But I'm optimistic that we will see the end to Afrophobia, and I can't give a time, but we will see an end to Afrophobia if each and everyone plays their role. Our member states play their role. The African Union plays its role, and so on and so forth. So I think that we'll be able. Then we will be able to see an end to Afrophobia. Let me see if there are more questions. There's a question here. Yeah, do you think education can play a role in curbing Afrophobia? Yes, I do think, and I've highlighted it earlier on, that education can play a role in curbing Afrophobia, and our schools need, universities and so on and so forth, need to play their role in making sure that Afrophobia is defeated. For example, I think I remember in my history class, there was a time when they were given an African map, and we're told to label the countries. This was finally a history class, and the lecturer at that time had said that he's doing this because he knows that we do not know African countries, and therefore it's vital that we label those countries so that we know about our continent. So I think things like that will help curb Afrophobia. The question is also, there's another question: do you think changing the history subject curriculum will assist in curbing this idea? Of course. The history subject curriculum I think needs to be changed also to a certain extent, so that there is more African content to it, than European content. Yes, we know about the World War I. Yes, we know about the World War II. But people, students do not know about the African continent, and therefore that needs to be the bulk of the curriculum, because in other continents people are studying their history, and in Africa we are not studying our history. So surely a change in curriculum can also curb Afrophobia to a certain extent. So yeah, I think, let me check for another question. What role does the protocol on the movement, what role does the protocol on the movement of free persons play? Okay, what role does the protocol on the movement of free persons play? So I think that's a very good question. Um, I believe that the protocol on the movement of free person has played, or it's playing a part in curbing Afrophobia, but it cannot just a protocol cannot just curb Afrophobia. It needs action, just like any other policy, just like any other treaty. You can sign a treaty, but if there's no action taken upon the treaty, then I think, or the protocol, then I think that it has failed. So I think the African Union has tried to develop that protocol in terms of asking member states to to allow free movement of African people amongst member states. Also by introducing the African passport, which it said that it will be up to member states to unveil it to their own citizens. So I think that was also another problem when the African Union decided to release an African Union passport and left it to African states to roll it out. Because I think to a certain extent it was trying to respect sovereignty of African countries, but also to a certain extent I think the African Union as a regional body that is in charge of these member states needs to also oversee the rolling out of these African passports and so on and so forth. Because then leaving it to member states, then member states can take it and just say we will see this later and let's move with other issues that need our attention. So the protocol on the movement of free persons really plays a role in curbing Afrophobia, but it needs action. It needs action to be taken by stakeholders, by the African Union, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's all for that's all the questions I've seen. Yeah. So I think since the questions are done here, I will end the session here. Thanks a lot for joining me, and till next time, stay safe, and yeah, thank you.